Most people understand, actually, that depression is caused by depressing things happening, okay? We know that, but psychiatry and the drug companies try to tell us, no. Depression is caused by something inside you called depressive disorder. Think about it, it's actually saying depression is caused by depression.
Hey everyone, before we get into this week's podcast, we got a pretty cool announcement to make. You are now able to connect with us. We have a pretty cool little widget that's on the website. Just go to paultaylor.biz/podcast. And near the top of the page, you'll see a little icon that says send a message to the Paul Taylor podcast. So what we can do with that, you just click on that and then you send us an audio message and we will get the audio message. Now, the first thing I want to do with using it is actually do an Ask Me Anything episode. So all you got to do if you got a question that you want me to cover is just go to paultaylor.biz/podcast, hit on start the recording, and then send us a message about what you would like me to talk about in the Ask Me Anything and leave your name. We will call it out on the show. I'll get that all put together. And the other thing you can do is just leave us a message about what you like about the podcast, what you don't like about the podcast. Did I talk too much? All of that sort of stuff. And just give us some feedback. And we will use that to continuously improve. So looking forward to hearing from you. Now, on with the podcast.
Professor John Reid, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How's old Blighty at the minute?
Well, like the rest of the world, pretty damn depressed, quite honestly. Given what happened in America last week, I think the world is stunned, and I'm stunned along with it. So, since you ask, it's incredibly depressing and frightening.
Yeah, and look, the depressing bit, you have kind of made a career out of studying in this area and publishing. You're a ridiculously prolific researcher in this area. I think you've published well over 200 publications. In the top 2% of cited scientists, according to Stanford University, and the chair of the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. So it is an honor for having you on this podcast, because I think I want to really bring your research to the attention of the general public, because I think what the public think about depression and antidepressant medication often doesn't stack up with the research or with what industry tells us. So just give our listeners a bit of a sense of your career, how you got interested in this area, when it was, and just some of the highlights so far.
Well, I think if we're honest, a lot of people who get into mental health, whether as researchers or clinicians, there are personal reasons. So a good day in my adolescence was trying to figure out why the rest of the world was crazy, and a bad day was trying to figure out why I was crazy. So that's why I went into psychology. I thought an undergraduate degree in psychology would give me some answers to that, but it didn't. So yeah, I mean, it's personal interests. I'm growing up in an averagely dysfunctional British family. And then later when I got a job as a psychiatric nursing aide, my very first job in New York, I was always struck by how if I could establish a relationship with people, and that's the difficult bit, they would mostly, not always, but mostly tell me awful things that had gone on in their lives, which was their understanding of why they had gone crazy or suicidal or whatever. So I was struck by that. But I was also struck by how uninterested most of the mental health staff were in their stories, and how when people tried to talk about, say, abuse they'd experienced or trauma, it was either ignored or, even worse, sort of dismissed as a delusion, symptom of their illness. Early on, I found that quite fascinating and distressing. And so when many, many years later I came back into academia, that was the area that I mostly wanted to focus on in terms of research.
That's interesting, because my wife is currently doing a master's degree in counselling, and the unit that she's on at the minute is about adverse childhood experiences, how they actually fundamentally restructure or reshape the brain, impact on certain areas of prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus. And And so just talk to our listeners about these adverse childhood experiences and what are they doing to people's brains and how do they then contribute to mental health problems like depression and psychosis in later life?
Well, I don't think you need to know too much about what's going on in the brain, although that is interesting, of course, but we can understand quite easily what's going on for kids as they grow up if they've been through really bad experiences without worrying about what specifically to the brain is doing what. Because what happens, of course, is if enough bad things have happened to you, that affects your ability to establish relationships in the future. So your attachment patterns can be problematic, not for everybody. We don't know overgeneralize. We'll come back to that. So attachment patterns can be difficult to trust people. So you keep people at a distance, or sometimes you do the opposite. So you get very clingy to people, which kind of puts people off. So it can cause difficulty in relationships. But worse than that, it can cause paranoia, of course. So if you've been done in enough times, it's really necessary and quite functional to scan for the next time something bad is happen. And you don't need, a lot of science to understand that, nor do you need to know which bit of the brain is operating. Although I'm glad people are looking into that. And so it's all quite, in a way, quite common sense that if you've been done in by other human beings, then your relationships with human beings in the future are going to be problematic. And you're also going to be, some people end up sort of normalizing abuse. So they kind of, in their adult relationships, they kind of expect or even just tolerate really poor behavior from other people because that's all they've never known. So in all those different ways, it basically messes up our relationships in the future, and including our relationship with ourselves and whether we're a lovable person. Because a lot of people, if you're abused early enough, of course, what do little kids do when something bad happens, or even something good? At that age, we hold ourselves responsible. Anything good happens, I did it. Anything bad happens, my fault. So people grow up blaming themselves for what happened and get into this pattern of anytime something bad happens, so it must be me. I'm just a terrible person. So in all those different ways, and that shows up across the diagnostic spectrum: depression, anxiety, eating disorders, so-called personality disorders, certainly my own area of psychosis, schizophrenia, so-called. Across all those diagnostic categories, child abuse is a massively and neglect is a massively powerful predictor.
And does the age at which this occurs, this abuse or neglect, the age at which it starts, does that have a big influence on whether or not, or the severity later in life, or is it very individualized?
Well, it is individualized, but we know there are several variables that predict whether or not child abuse and neglect the person ends up in bad shape later on, because not everybody does. And those predictors are the one you just named, early age of abuse, and the rest are quite obvious. So it's multiple abusers versus one, because then you generalize to the whole world is untrustable.
Yeah, I could see that.
And the third one, there's four of them. The third one is whether it happens inside the family or outside the family. Surprise, surprise. And the fourth one is, was anybody told at the time, and was the abuse or neglect interrupted? Did somebody do something about it? Because there's quite a difference between a singular event, however awful it is, say happening outside the family becomes aware of it, there's an intervention legally or whatever, and the child is believed, supported, and so forth. That's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, it's early inside the family. The child tries to tell somebody and then slapped about, perhaps for telling. How dare you say such a thing about Uncle Jimmy? And they're punished for that. That combination can lead to severe psychosis, in fact. So yeah, there's a range of variables there that to predict whether someone ends up in bad shape or not. And I could add, just on that issue of the fourth variable there, whether or not somebody's told and whether a person's believed, the average amount of time it takes somebody sexually abused now, I'm just specifically talking about sexual abuse, the average amount of time it takes them to tell another human being is 15 to 20 years.
What?
That's including people who tell at the time or the abuse is discovered. So that's when we get into how our mental health services are dealing with it, becomes quite an important variable, because very often, sometimes I'm trying to tell a mental health professional and they're the first person that has been told. So
Wow.
even 15, 20 years later. So it becomes very important how we respond in our mental health services when somebody tries to tell us about abuse and neglect.
And so let's dive into that. How do the mental health services generally approach these problems?
Well, sadly, with some exceptions, of course, not very well. We have published 2 or 3 reviews of the research literature on how often people are asked about abuse and then what the responses are when somebody does disclose. So to answer the first question, the last time we published a review, I think we found only about 20 studies altogether ever done on that. And the percentage of people in different mental health services who had ever been asked about abuse and neglect in childhood ranged from 22% to 0%. So we're not even asking most of the time. And these are studies all over the world, some in America, some in Britain, some in Australia. So your average mental health service still hasn't got to the point where it thinks it's important to ask. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to that, and that is getting better slowly over time. But that level of not asking, in one of our last papers, we described that as collusion with abuse, because this is not the butchers or the greengrocers or a supermarket or the dentist. These are the services where people go when they are distressed and experiencing despair and so forth. And for those services not to address this issue, that is collusion.
That really begs the question, why the hell is it not a standard protocol to ask straight away, like straight off the bat? So you go to the doctor, they will ask about family history. That's one of the first things that they do when they're investigating any physical illness is asking about family history and all. So why on earth is this not forefront, particularly when there's very strong evidence from multiple lines of research, right, including your stuff, including brain changes? Why is it not first line?
The simple answer is because our mental health services are dominated by a model, the medical model, which is largely unsubstantiated. And the model basically says if we become distressed or suicidal or desperate or confused, there's something wrong with our brains and our genes. And it's not really very much to do with the environment. And that's, you've got the chemical imbalance nonsense, which is completely refuted. It's just nonsense. You've got genetic theories about all of these different so-called illnesses. There's very little evidence for that. And you've got a dominance of one profession, psychiatry, and those folk are very well intentioned, but they are medically trained. They are trained to think like real doctors. They look for symptoms, they count symptoms, they come up with a label, and they pick a drug. That's largely what they do. They're not trained in the psychosocial causes of distress. They're certainly not trained in how to relate to people who are in a lot of distress and how to enable them to tell their story. And then the second part of the explanation, the answer to your question, is that model is rigorously and effectively backed by the pharmaceutical industry.
I'm sure, yeah. A number of different forces, yeah.
And the profession of psychiatry, all over the world, but particularly in the United States, has completely sold its soul to the drug companies about 20, 25 years ago. So this is why, because of this dominance of this ideology, and I think it is an ideology because there's very little evidence to support it, we repeatedly have people who have been done in 100 different ways. It can be war trauma, it can be just losses, series of losses, losing a job, losing a partner, or whatever, who need human support, a human understanding, and a human solution to their difficulties, who are told there's something wrong with their brain, something wrong with their genes, they need medication, or even worse, they need electric shock. And A, it doesn't work, and B, it's just not based in reality. So that's the simple answer to your question.
So let's talk about diagnosis. I do want to come back to the effectiveness of interventions, that particularly antidepressants and antipsychotics. But let's just talk, because you mentioned psychiatry. For me, it's really interesting. I'm currently doing a PhD in psychology, a bit of a background in neuroscience and physiology. But what I find really interesting is looking at the DSM, and there are now over 100 different conditions that people can be labeled, all these different labels, none of which have a biological signature. Like when we look at physical diseases, every physical disease has a biological signature that you can nail down. And to my understanding, not a single one of the psychiatric definitions or psychiatric conditions has a strong evidence-based biological signature. So, I mean, how useful are these diagnoses? And is there a strong case for having over 100 different ways that people are not functioning?
Okay, how useful are the diagnoses? Well, some people find them useful because when you are in a lot of distress and you're struggling to figure out what's going on, it can be reassuring for someone in authority, in a white coat perhaps, to tell you that what's going on is X disorder or Y disorder. That can be reassuring because it means the doctor knows what it is. The last thing you want to hear when you go to a doctor and you tell them your symptoms, the last thing you want to hear is, oh my God, I don't know what that is.
Absolutely. It kind of validates how people feel, right?
Yes, well, it's an illusionary validation. We'll come back to that, but it does make
Right.
It also makes you feel that you're not alone because other people have got this X or Y disorder, and it creates the belief that the doctor probably knows what to do. So diagnosis can be quite reassuring in the short term. However, it is illusory because these are not, first of all, they're not scientific categories in as much as they don't have very much reliability or validity. And reliability is the capacity for different experts to agree who's got what. So you can go to see 10 different psychiatrists, you might get between 7 and 8 different diagnoses, for instance. So there's no equal consistency there. And then the validity part is, does the diagnosis predict the future? Does it give you a prognosis? Does it predict, the outcome? No, it doesn't. So you get a diagnosis, 10 people getting a diagnosis of depression, and you go back 3 months later, there will be 10 different outcomes or trajectories. Same with psychosis or schizophrenia or whatever. Does it predict what's going to help, what treatment is going to help? No, it doesn't. It does predict what you're going to get, but it doesn't predict what's going to help. So, and there's some problems, apart from the lack of science, there's problems with the message that it gives, because it creates the illusion that there's, along with this reassuring thing that, yes, the doctor knows what it is, creates the illusion that there's something wrong with you, inside you. You have something wrong with your brain or your genes or something, or your hormones, or the problem is entirely located in you. It's a fairly and if it's something wrong with your brain, that suggests it's a fairly permanent, ongoing problem. It's not the flu or something. It's something different and malfunctioning about your brain, which is a very powerful message to tell somebody. Although, again, some people can find that reassuring. They go, oh, well, that explains all the things I've ever... Yeah, now I get it. But problem is, there isn't anything wrong with a person's brain. There is no chemical imbalance behind depression or anything else. So that's an illusion as well. And this is especially true of its children, but it's also true of us adults. It means you haven't got to look in the environment. So it's particularly worrying when children get a psychiatric diagnosis, because then first thing you should look for when a child is distressed is what's going on at home, what's going on in the school, what help does that family need with little Johnny or little Jane or whatever. But now instead you've got there's something wrong with little Johnny, which is why he can't sit still at school, or why he's getting very angry and shouting at the teachers or whatever. So it individualizes, it pathologizes, it creates the impression that something permanently wrong with you. And then we worry why somebody doesn't get better 5 years later. So they're unscientific, unhelpful overall. And they don't actually explain anything. So I'll just give an example. Most people understand, actually, that depression is caused by depressing things happening. Okay, we know that, but psychiatry and the drug companies try to tell us, no. Depression is caused by something inside you called depressive disorder. And one of the symptoms of this thing inside you, depressive disorder, is depression. That's what's causing your depression. So you have, and it sounds sensible until you think about it. It's actually saying depression is caused by depression. It's like, it's backwards circular logic. And it had quite attractive at one level for those reasons I said at the beginning. It's kind of, now I know why I'm so depressed. I'm one of those people with that thing. Yeah. But people who are depressed 9 times out of 10 aren't going to get better unless we help them deal with the things that are depressing them. So it's a very powerful model. One of its attractions is its simplicity, because you haven't got to think anymore. You haven't got to try and figure out what's going on in someone's life. And if you're not very good at connecting to people's feelings when they're distressed, it's quite attractive to professionals who want to keep people at a distance, keep the emotions away, because it is quite hard sitting with someone who's upset. Oh, well, I don't have to talk to them about what's going on in their lives. I don't have to sit and wait 5-10 minutes while they finish crying. I just give them a label and a pill and off they go.
2 points on that. I think that's a really good point. And there's a couple of things I want to come back to that you said there. But I know somebody who had mental health issues and went to see a psychiatrist. And they said the psychiatrist sat on the other side of the room. No rapport building, no relationship building, just sat on the other side of the room with a clipboard and fired off a bunch of questions and then went, you have this disorder and you need to take this medication, right? And what we know in lots of things in medicine, the warmth of the relationship between the medical professional and the individual has a huge influence on the outcome, right? And that's that human connection piece. But what I wanted to the other thing around that as well is that I guess what you're saying is it makes it easier to deal with for the clinician. So rather than having to dive into this complex web of someone's past and then help them to try to make sense of the world, I just write a script and off they go.
Yes. So intellectually and emotionally, it's just far easier for mental health professionals who don't really want to get engaged with people's emotions.
Yeah. There's a Harvard psychiatrist. She's written a book called Dopamine Nation. I forget her name. And she said that she realized that psychiatry was broken when she found herself, as soon as she started interacting with the patient and the patient was talking, in her head, she was going, which box am I going to put this person in? Rather than actually listening to them. And that's when she realized it was broken.
Yeah, I want to say something. I do want to come back to what you said about the human connection there and how we know that that's a major component. Just to reinforce what you said, Paul, because we have conducted research, big surveys of people on antidepressants and antipsychotics. In those surveys, we asked them about the relationship they had with the person who gave them the pill. Did they feel understood? Did they and just rate the quality of that relationship, even if it was a 10-minute interaction? And the perceived quality of the relationship was a powerful predictor of whether the drugs worked.
Yeah. Look, we know this from all the placebo research that if there is a connection between medical professional and the individual, the placebo effect goes through the roof, right?
Absolutely true for psychologists as well. It's not just medical situations, and the placebo effect or non-specific effect is huge.
I wanted to come back to, you just mentioned some statistics about the reliability and the validity. And if you could just go through this again, through the lens of, would any other branch of science accept that level of reliability and validity?
No, it does raise.
And sorry, John, can you just, for the listeners at home, I think it's worthwhile double clipping because there's a lot of lay people listening to this. Just really dive into what that reliability and validity actually means in the real world.
Okay, well, let me give you a very, very specific example. That field that I work in, which is psychosis, the major diagnosis in that field, as everybody knows, is schizophrenia. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual says there are 5 types of symptoms for schizophrenia. We don't really need things like hallucinations, delusions, and so forth. We don't need to go into what they all are. And then it says you need 2 of these 5 to get the diagnosis. All right? Now, most people can immediately figure out what's wrong with that. It means that, let's say I've got hallucinations and delusions and nothing else. And you, Paul, you've got, let's say, thought disorder and catatonia, 2 of the other symptoms, but nothing else. So now you and I have nothing in common, but we have the same diagnosis. Now, in science, this is called a disjunctive category. And in English, it is just utter bollocks. Beautiful. And the fact that a discipline claiming to be a science, after 100 years, this diagnosis has been in existence for 100 years, they have redefined it many, many times. And the best they can come up with in the 21st century is a disjunctive category whereby people can have the same diagnosis with no symptoms in common, is bizarre. And it speaks volumes about the scientific status of psychiatry as a discipline. Because you asked me, would this be tolerated in any other discipline? And the answer is clearly no. But yet you have psychiatrists, good people, intelligent people, who genuinely think there is this thing called schizophrenia that causes hallucinations and delusions, rather than it just being a word that describes people who have those experiences. And despite the fact that people can have that diagnosis without having anything in common, they believe that it exists, and they believe that they can tell who's got it and who hasn't. And they can't. The level of agreement between them is very, very low. Oh, this wouldn't matter, except that this is a very debilitating diagnosis. Marks people often for life. And it really is time we stopped using these diagnoses. It's unscientific, and it's unethical, and it's stigmatizing. The only thing it does is perpetuate the myth that psychiatry is operating in a scientific way, and that these are medical problems. They're not medical problems. They're reactions. They're understandable reactions to adverse life events.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to now talk about what the research says about the interventions, right? And I'm going to read out something for the listeners. This is from a paper that you wrote with James Williams in 2018. And what you did was you looked at a whole heap of people who were taking, it was 1,431 people who were on an antidepressant across 38 countries, which I think is really important for listeners to understand. So it's cross-cultural. And you ask them about their experience, which is different to what the drug companies tell the doctors, right? And we can get into this, but I'm just going to read this out for people. So 61% of the respondents reported at least 10 of the 20 adverse effects, most commonly feeling emotionally numb, 71%, feeling foggy or detached, 70%, feeling not like myself, 66%, sexual difficulties, 66%, drowsiness, 63%, 60% had a reduction in positive feelings, and a whopping 50% felt suicidal as a result of the drugs. And then withdrawal effects were reported by 59% and addiction by 40%. And as you mentioned earlier on, the rate of adverse effects were higher for those prescribed multiple antidepressants than those who took antipsychotics. Younger age and longer use of antidepressants were positively related to total adverse effects. But, and something you mentioned earlier as well, less than 5% were actually told about these things by the clinician administering them. So when you did that research, did that just blow you away, or were you kind of expecting that from stuff that you'd seen previously?
Some were expected and some were surprised. So things that were a surprise was the extent of the suicidality and the extent of withdrawal. We knew about most of the other effects, maybe not that quite as high as we found, but we weren't too surprised. But to find that about 50% of people taking a drug that is supposed to lift your mood is making you more suicidal is it's difficult to know what the right words are. I mean, obviously bizarre comes to mind, but it's staggering. Now, I have to qualify it a bit because the increased suicidality for most people lasts only for the first few weeks of treatment and then dies down a bit. So if you get through those first few weeks, then the suicidality from the drugs goes away. However, that's still quite alarming, especially if you're not told. Some people are told that, but a few, but most people are not told that. So here you are, depressed enough that you're willing to take some pills to try and fix that. And just at the point where you're hoping, maybe I found a solution, maybe I'm going to feel better, you start feeling more suicidal. That's scary, I think. And I think it's safe to say any other drug in medicine that had the exact opposite effect of what it's intended to do would never have made it to the market in the first place, and certainly would be withdrawn as soon as that reality became known. What they have done, they have put some warnings on antidepressants. So it does state that if you read, if people trouble to read the little leaflet in the packet. I don't know how many people actually read that stuff. I have to admit, I probably don't when I'm given medication, but that's my fault. You should read it. It does say for young people only. In fact, the evidence is that it's pretty much the same for older people as well. But yeah, it is bizarre. There seems to be a separate set of standards ethically and scientifically for psychiatry compared to the rest of medicine. That would not be allowed in any other form of medicine. Then we can come on to withdrawal in a minute.
Yeah, because I was going to say that would just not be allowed in anywhere else. Now, it's not just your group. That when I read that research paper, I then diving into PubMed, similar articles, and found other research groups have found similar things. So this is not an anomaly. This is across the board, and it's very different to what the lay person and doctors believe, as in these drugs are safe and they're effective, right? But withdrawal is it's another thing, isn't it? Because people are on those drugs, and 1 in 7, I think it is in the UK, 1 in 7 or 1 in 8. I think it's 1 in 8 in the UK, 1 in 7 in Australia, 1 in 8 in New Zealand. Similar in the United States, of people are on these medications, are on antidepressants or antipsychotic medications.
Higher now. 1 in 6 in all of those 3 countries are now on antidepressants. And if you're female, it's 1 in 4, 1 in 5. Those women.
I read about the females. I was going to say, I thought that was just the United States, but it's 1 in 4. And then if people do try to get off them, there are really significant impacts from a withdrawal perspective, which I'm just going to ask you about in a second. But the average, I think, time that people are taking these drugs is more than 2 years. That's the data I saw in Australia. You probably got your finger on the pulse better than that. So talk us, like, this starts to become a circular issue, doesn't it? Because I take the drugs because I'm feeling depressed. If I get over the bump, I know a number of people who are on there, and they just say it makes the really bad not so bad, right? So it grays everything out, right? And then when people do want to get off them, they have really significant withdrawal effects, and they straight away go, oh, fuck, this is the depression coming back in full force, so I have to stay on this stuff.
Let's do the numbers first. So it's about half of people, so it's not everybody, it's about half of people when they try and come off antidepressants will experience withdrawal effects, which is a lot higher than the drug companies have told anybody or anybody's ever told. And of those people, about half will describe the withdrawal effects as severe. So to get it in perspective, it's like 1 in 4 people will experience severe withdrawal effects when they try to come off. That's high. 1 in 4 is high, but it's not. I'm just saying it's not everybody. This has been denied for decades by the drug companies, and that misinformation has been passed via doctors onto patients. The standard view has been that they like to call it discontinuation symptoms, which is a drug company term designed specifically to sort of minimize it and make it sound like it isn't proper withdrawal. And the message has been for decades that it's rare, it's mild, and it lasts about 2 weeks. And that was the drug company line that was sort of developed in the 1990s and regurgitated by the professional psychiatry, and I have to say many GPs as well, until very, very recently. The good news is that in Britain, at least, we are really making some headroads into that. We've had a government investigation into it. Public Health England has published a full report on these sorts of things and is making recommendations that the NHS in England must have withdrawal support services for people trying to get off antidepressants. And we're in the process of trying to get those services off the ground. So we are a bit ahead of the rest of the world on this. So changes, it's possible and it's coming. It's fought tooth and nail has been fought by the Royal College of Psychiatry here, although they eventually got on board. And our NICE guidelines, which is National Institute of Clinical Excellence, changed their guidelines. So we have, in a long-winded way, I'm saying we are making some progress on. But I think still around the rest of the world, I'm sure in America in particular, there's a complete ignorance amongst the GPs who, the research is out there now. There's a lot of studies showing that these figures that we're talking about and several reviews of the literature. It's out there. And while we're on it, now just some practical advice to people who, when they do try to come off antidepressants, it needs to be done slowly, obviously.
Slowly, yeah. Yep.
And then most people will know that, but what the people don't know is that towards the very end of coming off, you need to slow down even more. Just when you think you can throw the last ones away, that's when you need to cut it in half, cut it in quarter, and really, really do the last couple of months or whatever very, very slowly indeed. And at every stage of coming off, you come down a little bit and see how it goes. If you get some withdrawal effects, wait for them to subside, then come down a little bit more. It's a very gradual, careful process. People can do it, of course, but as you absolutely pointed out, Paul, the biggest problem is if you try to talk to your doctor who has only drug company misinformation to go on, and the doctor will say, this is your illness coming back. Just at the point where you need support and an informed medical professional to help you come off very slowly, the exact opposite happens. And so the medication is reinstated and the people get trapped. And that's why that the average amount of time that people are on these drugs is going up and up and up. It's over 3 years now, the average amount of time people are on. And
3 years.
That's average. And some are on for 10, 20 years. I think, and podcasts like this are helping to get the information out there. I think change will have to come because unlike antipsychotics, which is taken by a relatively small number of people, we're talking about millions and millions of people on antidepressants. Everybody. If you're not on antidepressants yourselves, you know several people who are.
Absolutely.
So this information will permeate gradually, and people will learn how to come off very slowly, and doctors will eventually get evidence-based information rather than drug company information, and then we'll be able to help.
What's really is banging around in my head very loudly here, John, is given that the evidence is out there, written by people like you and others who we see this over and over again, the evidence of the side effects and the withdrawal symptoms being very different than what the drug companies advertised and teach the doctors. Now that it's out there and that people are doing something about it, I mean, the words informed consent and duty of care are just banging in my head here. Is that why hasn't there been, from whether it's the health minister or somewhere very high or psychiatry, to go, we need to now re-educate doctors urgently about the real effects of these drugs and give people informed consent, where somebody would sit down with a doctor who has depression and they go, okay, here's your options. You can go on a drug and rattle off all of the side effects that we see in the withdrawal symptoms, or we can do some alternative treatment, which we'll talk about in a second. Like, why has that not happened with extreme urgency now that the data is very clear?
Well, it's a bit simplistic, but one, we'll call it a partial explanation, is that when people in those sort of positions of authority, politicians, for instance, have questions about medical issues like this, who do they consult with?
They go to the psychiatrists, right?
They go to the Royal College of Psychiatry or the American Psychiatric Association and ask them for their view. And their view is dictated by the drug companies. They won't say that. They think they're being independent and scientific, but they're not. And the line they will give to the politician is, you must not do anything that will scare people into stopping taking their medication. People will die, and it will be your responsibility if you have promoted this information, this myth, which they see as misinformation, that will make people stop taking their medication. And that the drug companies are incredibly powerful lobbyists. In America, they have, and this is out of date now, it's probably more, they have one full-time lobbyist for every member of the House of Representatives.
That's just bonkers.
And the professional psychiatry bodies are not as powerful as the drug companies, but they don't have to be as powerful because the politicians come to them. Say, what should we do about this? To be fair, in Britain, they have, on antidepressants, they have finally, kicking and screaming, they have changed their guidelines here, and they are now saying that, yes, antidepressant withdrawal is real, and they are supporting our efforts to try and get services. So credit to them and credit's due, but for 30 years before that, they just regurgitated the drug company misinformation. They've got there. Now, the American Psychiatric Association is another matter altogether. They are so embedded with the drug companies over there. I'm not hopeful.
There's really stunning parallels to big food, which is an area that I know a lot of, and the lobby groups that go, and I was kind of expecting that answer because of it's the same playbook of big food, big tobacco. And me and you are both scientists and probably as far away from conspiracy theorists as you could get. But when you look into this world, it is a very, very murky world. I want you to give people just a sense of how the pharmaceutical industry influences public opinion and research and clinical practice. Because for the example of the food, there's the International Life Sciences Institute, which is funded by Big Food, that then sponsors research at universities that is deliberately designed to put doubt in consumers' minds and cloud the judgment, right? So that's one tactic that Big Food uses, and it lobbies. So tell our listeners what sort of things that the pharmaceutical industry does to influence public and practice research.
Well, as you've already alluded to, they're big funders of research. Most drug trials, psychiatric drug trials, are funded by drug companies.
Which any sensible person would go, hey, there's a red flag straight away.
You would think so, but when sort of 80 to 90% of trials are drug company studies, it becomes normalized. And they say, it's not a problem, John, because we now declare our conflicts of interest. So it's not a problem, which I think is quite laughable. It's like saying somebody who committed a theft saying, well, I've admitted to the theft, so or why are you still annoyed about it? And it's right that they should declare their interest. And sometimes the list of interests is almost as long as the article itself. But that's first way they influence it. Another way, in America, they influence things by direct-to-consumer advertising. There's only 2 countries in the world, and I think actually in New Zealand it's been stopped.
It's New Zealand and America, isn't it, that they can advertise drugs to people?
Somebody told me they either tried to stop it or had stopped it in New Zealand. It never
I
happened.
think the wheels are in motion to stop it in New Zealand, I believe.
And anyway, they don't do it. I lived there for 20 years. You do not see advertisements in New Zealand television like you do in America. Whenever I come over, sitting in a hotel room, switch the telly on, every third or fourth advertisement, people around the rest of the world don't realize this, every third or fourth advertisement is a drug company advertisement.
Absolutely. I was in America a couple of weeks ago, and the amount of ads for drugs saying, go and ask your doctor about this drug, unbelievable.
Yes. The other way they influence is by funding supposedly independent NGOs or charities. So in America, the biggest example of this is NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, presents itself as a pressure group for patients and relatives. It's absolutely a front group for the drug companies. As the last time I looked about, I think it was 15 different drug companies were funding NAMI, who unsurprisingly are always pushing for more medication, more coercive legislation to lock people away and get on the sort of injectable drugs so that people can't stop taking it. So that they do that, and they do that all over the world. We're lucky again in Britain. Our largest mental health charity called Mind does not take any money from drug companies, but that's another way they do it. And that's not just with psychiatry. That's probably in your field as well. I don't know, but it's certainly in all sorts of areas. And the other area, unsurprisingly, is the internet. We've published studies where we've looked at, say, the top 50. If you Google schizophrenia and you look at the top 50 websites or whatever, more than half are drug company funded, and they don't always declare that. Some declare it, some are upfront, some are not. And surprise, surprise, when you analyze the websites that are drug company funded versus those that are independently funded, the drug company ones push a biological explanation and they push medications. And in my field of schizophrenia, they are much more likely to describe this as not only as an illness, but a debilitating, lifelong, chronic, dangerous illness. You ask how they influence these. They are very good researchers. They don't spend a penny that doesn't influence things. And that's not true. Sometimes they spend money to make themselves look like they're doing good. Yes. So they'll occasionally fund something on the other side of it. But by and large, and I actually don't blame them, Paul. Their job is to increase profit for their shareholders.
Absolutely. And it's the same with big food. That's their job.
Yes, they shouldn't lie, but we all know that advertising is lies. We don't, when you buy washing powder, you really don't think that it washes whiter than white, do you? But we know that. But what I find so upsetting is that the profession of psychiatry does not have a professional ethical boundary between itself and a profit-making industry. They have just given up on that, and that is shameful. It's shameful.
Little detour. Knowing all of this stuff that you know, how do you stop this frustration? Because I can sense the frustration. How do you personally stop this frustration from driving you completely bonkers?
Great question. Well, first of all, knowing that there are thousands of people around the world engaged in the same struggle. So it's a bit of a cliche, but this is the last, in some ways, the hardest and last human rights struggle. This is a human rights issue.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And it is very, very hard because we're up against the sort of monolithic power base that we've been describing. But you meet the best people on the way. Like just on Friday, we had 500 people on the online launch of a book called Drop the Disorders. Doesn't matter the detail, but the 500 people around the world all focus in the same direction, sharing the frustration, and in all different ways, from service users to very high-powered researchers and professors or politicians, all in their different ways trying to shift the paradigm towards an evidence-based, humane approach. And it's very hard, and it is frustrating. And, if I've got a disorder, it's banging my head against a brick wall disorder. So, and, well,
which, unlike the antidepressants, it's great when it stops.
Indeed. So, yes, it is frustrating. But as I say, there's so many people involved in the struggle. And we see gains. There are pockets in every country. There are pockets of excellence, and there are alternatives, which I think you're going to ask me about in a second.
Yes,
there are alternatives
absolutely.
that need nurturing and highlighting. And within the mental health system, there are some really, really good people, including psychiatrists. I know I've made blanket statements about the profession of psychiatry. Within that, there are some excellent psychiatrists who, despite their psychiatric training, are doing some very, very good work, and are not scared of people's emotions, and are not scared of the complexity of people's lives. And then there's the rest of the mental health workforce, because you have to remember that psychiatry makes up about 1% of the mental health workforce. Somehow they've grasped 90% of the power. Sound familiar?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you just kind of described the Catholic Church for me.
Almost economists, for that matter.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's the thing, right, is that money talks. It really does. So let's now that we have opened people's eyes to what the data is actually saying, what are some alternatives to antidepressant and antipsychotic medications? And then, at the end, we can then point to people in directions for resources if they are on these drugs and do want to get off, but alternative interventions and treatments.
Okay, well, just before we do that, I need to stress that for some people, the diagnoses are helpful, and for some people, the medications are helpful. So, and certainly I should stress that do not stop taking your medication on the basis of listening to one podcast. Right?
Yes.
So
and I think particularly, John, if they have serious disease, that, so not mild, if they have severe, I think that's when the drugs tend to, or seem to be, from my reading of it, more helpful for people who are really debilitated.
Well, let's just deal with that quickly then, and we'll come to alternatives. A while ago, Irving Kirsch, who's at Harvard Medical School, got hold of all of the drug trials for antidepressants that had previously been buried. And by buried, I mean to get a drug license, you only need to do submit two studies that show effectiveness and safety. So the drug companies will do 20, 25, or however many it takes until they get two that show efficacy, and they submit those two. Professor Kirsch got hold of all the others, analyzed all of those, and he found that for about 95% of people on antidepressants, there is no difference between antidepressants and placebo.
Is that the Emperor's New Drugs, the paper that he wrote? Yeah, I've got the paper. Yeah. That's stunning. I mean, I want that to sink into people. For 95% of them, the antidepressants were no more effective than placebo, which is not saying that placebo doesn't have an effect, right?
Well done. That's important. Yes, that's absolutely important. So it's what we were talking about before. People are feeling better on antidepressants, but not because of the pills, but because somebody's listened to a little bit, listened at least long enough to give them a pill, that's something, they've decided they've got a problem and they've decided to do something about it. And they are doing something about it. And the pills certainly make you feel different. So it's really quite easy under those circumstances. Oh, well, I'm feeling better. Placebo is Latin for I please, but which is
there you go.
There you go. That's all you need to know, isn't it? And then there's other 5% for whom there is a difference. And that's at the severe, there's mild, moderate, and severe. So people at the top end of the severe category do get some sort of effect that is not a placebo effect. And Irving suggested that that's because they are so depressed they cannot access the placebo effect.
Right.
So down that it doesn't matter that someone's listened to them or they've done something. So anyway, but I think the important thing is that for 95% of people, there's nothing about these pills that are actually helping them. So that's important. That's important to know. So when you think about coming off them and you worry about, am I going to get worse as a result of coming off? The answer almost invariably is no. You're not going to be worse because of the absence of the pills. You may feel worse because of the withdrawal effects.
Once you get off though, then.
Sorry, you asked me about alternatives and I went off on a tangent.
No, but that's important background, I think.
This is where, if I'm doing an undergraduate lecture, this is the point where I make the joke about the definition of thought disorder is going off on a tangent and not being able to come back. So where were we, Paul? If I can't find my way back now, that means I've got schizophrenia. Anyway, bad joke. So the alternatives. The first thing to say about the alternatives, they are all the variations are based on the assumption that the core ingredient of an effective treatment, if we must call it that, for mental health problems is based on human relationships. So all of the things I'm going to talk about now are centered around quality of the relationship between the helper and the person being helped, and an understanding that the problems have come from, very often, faulty or dysfunctional relationships in the past. So it's all, some people call that trauma-informed therapy because you focused on the traumas in the past. Some people call it relational therapy, it doesn't matter. It's about human beings. And the basic idea here is some of my ideas are a bit simplistic, the idea that depression is caused by depressing things. My idea about therapy, which is also one that everybody knows already, if distress and despair and fear is based on human beings having done not very nice things to us in the past, the answer is human beings doing nice things to us in the present. It's not sophisticated, is it? But there you go. So some examples of the alternatives. One that's catching on around the world is called open dialogue. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, I haven't heard of that.
Okay, all right. So this originated in Finland. It's based on the idea that, and it's especially for psychosis, it's based on the idea that when somebody has a psychotic episode or loses contact with reality or whatever you want to, however you want to describe it, it's very important to, as quickly as possible, gather together the key people in that person's life, whether that's family, friends, teachers, doesn't matter who it is, get a group of people together, including the person themselves, and together talk about what has gone wrong and what might be helpful. And the role of the professional is not to tell the person what's gone wrong, but to help these key people in the person's life develop a plan together about how to help that person. It's not rocket science, except that there's very good science behind it. This works, surprise, surprise, which is completely different from taking the person away from their family, locking them up.
And giving them electroconvulsive shocks.
Oh, don't start me there. That's a whole nother hour. Yeah. But I was in New Zealand for 20 years, and the Maori people in New Zealand cannot understand why us white people, when somebody gets distressed, takes the person away from their family, sits them privately in a room, and has a private one-on-one discussion, which cannot be shared with anybody else, which is our understanding of confidentiality, isn't it? So it makes sense to us. But they don't. Why on earth would you do that? We're the pig. So they have an open dialogue sort of approach. They will literally get together the extended family, which in Maoridom could sometimes be 20, 30 people, and talk together about what these voices the person has heard, what it means. And they'll come up with understandings like it's dead grandmothers speaking to them or whatever. It won't be things that I understand or agree with, because I don't think dead grandmothers can speak to you, but who cares what I think? That's a cultural understanding, a shared understanding. And what those two things have in common is that it does not pathologize the individual. It's not like there's something wrong with this person that we need to be frightened of them or push them away or lock them up or treat them as different. It means this is a group problem with a group solution, and it's a completely different sort of approach. Another example is the Hearing Voices Network, which now has Hearing Voices groups, I think, are in 23, 24 countries. And these are people who hear voices coming together to support one another. Again, similar sort of basis. It's about relationships. It's not, nobody has the power to diagnose one another or medicate one another or impose an understanding. Nobody's going to be saying it's all biology or it's all trauma. Everybody, might be 12 people in a room. They might have 12 different explanations for their voice hearing, and they will share coping mechanisms that no mental health professional will ever tell you. For instance, they will share tricks like, if you want to stop the voices immediately, turn the radio on or read a book.
Because your attention.
That's right. Yes, which is simple and obvious, but no mental health professionals can tell you that. They might, as some of the Hearing Voices people are beginning to educate us professionals, so that's good. And that's going on all around the world. There's less research on that. We can't do randomized controlled trials on that, but we have run quite a few now, surveys of people who attend those groups. And they talk very much about it's helpful because of the non-judgmental atmosphere in the room and because it's people helping one another. And that works. Not for everybody. I mean, some people can't stand groups, So nothing works for everybody. I'm just giving you some examples of the fact that there are alternatives. And another is the power threat meaning framework, which isn't really a treatment model. It's a way of thinking. It's an alternative in a way, or in addition to diagnosis, which is something that us British psychologists have put together, which is out there on the internet for free. The power threat meaning framework, which basically, to express it simply, it means instead of asking what's wrong with somebody, you ask what's happened to them, and then how do they make sense of that. Again, none of this stuff is, complicated or rocket science. And I think it's the right time to mention that when you do surveys around the world, asking people what causes mental health problems in every country except America, God bless America, they seem to get everything wrong. But in 27 countries where this has been done, you ask people what's wrong, what causes mental health problems. They prioritize social things. They prioritize loneliness, loss, trauma, abuse, being a refugee, unemployment. We know why we get upset, don't we? Because upsetting things happen. And then we'll ask them what sort of treatment should be given, whether that's depression or schizophrenia or anything. They prioritize social solutions. Primarily talking therapies are much more in demand around the world than medication or certainly than ECT. So I guess I'm stressing that because sometimes those of us calling for change positioned as sort of a bit radical or a bit extreme. But the public almost everywhere is already on that page. And now so is the United Nations and the World Health Organization, who are putting out last 2023, just last year, they put out a joint document calling for an end to the medical model.
Yeah, well, you're just describing the biopsychosocial model versus the medical model, right? That takes into account the people's backgrounds, their social connections, but you're talking about it from an intervention perspective.
I'm talking more about the social than the bio. It's a bit complicated.
Sorry. I should have said psychosocial. I should have taken the bio out, right?
Well, yes, except of course the brain is important, but let's just very quickly deal with that. The brain is important, but not in the way that the drug companies and psychiatry tells us. If the best way to illustrate this quickly, say I've lost 2 or 3 people in the last 3 months who are very dear to me. My thoughts will be different, my feelings will be different, and my brain will be operating differently at that point in time. So will my metabolism and everything. It will all be sort of closed down. Along comes a researcher looking for the cause of my depression. They scan my brain and see what's going on in my brain. And yes, it is operating differently. Has that caused my depression? Or have the losses caused it? And that's the fundamental mistake that biological psychiatry keeps making. They keep finding these brain differences and simplistically, and I have to say stupidly, think that they're causal. They're not causal. They're the result of what's going on in person's life. And the quickest way to get that across to them is, what use would a brain be that didn't respond to what's going on in the environment?
That's a very good point, John, is that our brains are designed to respond to the environment, that there is remodeling of our brains because of that neuroplasticity. And that's what we do, is we respond to the environment. I'm going to throw a couple of other things just to get your opinion on them. And I think here more is around some of the drivers of mild depression. I'm not talking about the severe or even potentially the moderate. I'm talking about the large percentage of worried well who are out there and who are on an antidepressant. So a recent publication this year, an umbrella review of ultra-processed food, found convincing class 1 evidence, which you very rarely see in nutrition, that increasing ultra-processed foods in the diet increases the risk of anxiety by 48%, and common mental health disorders by 53%, right? And we know that in your country and my country, more than 50% of all calories consumed are ultra-processed shit, right? And if you're eating a shit diet, I say to people, you're playing Russian roulette with your mental health, especially when you combine that with not exercising, because the human genome is so dependent on physical exercise. I mean, I could wax lyrical for at least an hour of the impact of myokines, and particularly on the brain, on all of these different neurotransmitters and feel-good chemicals, that basically, that if you're not exercising, eating well, and sleeping well, you're actually putting your brain at a massively increased vulnerability, I believe. And then you have these natural life events that cause us to be sad, and then boom, people are depressed. And then the answer is there's a pill for that, which is the easy way out, because it's a shitload easier to take a pill than get off your ass and exercise and stop eating shit food and get off Netflix and social media at night, right? And so I'd like your opinion on that. But then also, I think, as an adjunctive therapy for treatment, is getting people eating a wholesome diet and exercising and being good around their sleep hygiene, so as that it works in with all of those really important social interventions that you're talking about. What's your thoughts on those things?
Absolutely agree with all of that. It's not they're not my area of expertise, but none of that surprises me. So it's crucially important. Some of that is beginning to happen over here. It's called different things, but some people are calling it social prescribing. So some of our GP practices now have social prescribing offices or whatever they're called, where somebody will be encouraged to think of different ways that they can. I guess the theme is do something, get involved in something, whether that's running, exercise, swimming, or dramatic society, or chess club, or whatever it doesn't sort of matter. So, and I think a lot of the motivation for that is around relationships again.
Do something with other people, ideally.
Yes, but it does address some of the issues you're raising, like exercise. And diet will certainly be on the agenda when people meet with the social prescriber. That's a very exciting development, I think. And they're located in GP's offices.
Oh, nice.
But that's part of the problem, because the GP, who has no time at all, has to try and refer people to somewhere else, and very often we don't bother going or whatever. They're actually right there in the GP practice. This will be addressing exactly those points that you raised, which I find are incredibly important.
John, I am aware of your time. You've been very generous with it, but there is a question I think we have to address. And so, what is helpful and what is unhelpful for people who are trying to withdraw from antipsychotic medications, antidepressants, antipsychotics? And are there any resources that you can point them to as well?
Okay, so general guidelines around what's helpful and what's unhelpful. So what's helpful is ideally, and I know this is difficult, ideally get the support of the person who prescribed the drugs. Currently, that's quite difficult to do in many circumstances, but at least try. You might just be surprised, especially if you take some research with you or whatever. But be prepared for that person to say no, especially with antipsychotics. They'll say, no, it's not safe for you to come off. You'll go crazy, blah, blah, blah. But try, because that is the ideal situation. Other than that, there's a lot of support out there on Facebook groups and online. And we shouldn't need to use online groups to provide things that professionals should be providing. But I think for the next 5-10 years, until we educate the professionals, these groups are going to be still very important. One, for instance, is there's an organization called Inner Compass. I can email you I don't know if you can put them up on.
That'd be great. Yeah, no, I'll stick these links on for people for sure.
Yeah, all right. So In a Compass is one. But there's lots around the world. There's a lot of resources at an organization that I'm chair of that you mentioned before, the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. And there's a new one also called Psychotropic. I think it's called the Psychotropic Deprescribing Council, which has just started, a similar organization. There's lots out there on the internet. And some of them are people supporting one another, like In a Compass. And there's one called Surviving Antidepressants. There's lots. And then others are like these institutes and organizations that are trying to provide resources and research for people. So that's another way to go. Getting support from family and friends is key if you can. It can be very hard for partners or children or whoever when you are going through with withdrawal. There will be times when you will be a pain in the ass because you're stressed. You're very stressed, and so people need to sort of know what's going on and try and get support from family. And then what I was mentioning before is that the importance of not going too fast. And the problem is that's different for each individual. So by and large, rather than reducing, so the mistake in the past has been reduce 10 grams or 10 milligrams or whatever per time. Don't do that. Reduce by a percentage. So if you reduce by 10% every time, then the actual amount you're reducing each time is getting smaller as time goes on. Hope that it's called parabolic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It sounds a bit practical, but it's really important. It really can make the difference. There's some good research now. It's early days, but we are fairly convinced that is a safer way to go. So especially at the end, very, very, very slowly. I mean, it's to do with the way that the brain has adapted without going into more technicalities. So those are the key things. So the unhelpful, I guess, is the opposite of all of those. Trying to do it completely by yourself with no support and going too quickly. Those are the no-nos. Can be done. And having said all of that, inexplicably, some people are able to just go completely cold turkey. So people sometimes say, John, I didn't need all that. I'm strong-willed and I just stopped and it was horrible, but I got through it. Well done.
But not the recommended mechanism.
Not recommended. And it doesn't mean you're not strong-willed if you can't do that. I'm just acknowledging that everybody's different.
What's your hope for the future in all of this?
I think we do need a complete paradigm shift. We have to let go of this simplistic and actually pessimistic idea that when we are distressed and feel hopeless or confused or desperate, that means there's something wrong with our brains or our genes. It doesn't. It means that we are human beings, and when awful things happen, interpersonal worlds, or as the sort of things you're talking about in terms of our nutrition, we will feel terrible, and we need solutions that address that. And we have to free our mental health services from the influence of drug companies. And until we've done that, this paradigm change won't happen. And that isn't going to be easy because they're not going to let go of their power. One of the most hopeful things for me recently is being involved in some legal cases around ECT, which I'll go into because we're running out of time. But I said for a long time, change is more likely to come when we get people into court than when we publish research papers.
You know, I was thinking earlier on, John, when the day that somebody starts to take doctors and psychiatrists to court for not giving them proper informed consent, that's when we might see a bit of a change, right? Sorry, but I interrupt you. So just for clarity for our listener, ECT is electroconvulsive shock therapy, right?
That's correct, yes. So several cases in America and 2 in Canada and 1 in the UK currently working their way through. One last year, I was in a jury trial in Florida where I was the expert witness there, and we won a jury trial case whereby we found the manufacturers of the ECT machine, who happened to be 2 psychiatrists, guilty of not informing psychiatrists of the risks. And that was a major breakthrough. So that's the first one. And once you've won one, there tends to be a domino effect. I personally think ECT will be gone within the next 5 to 10 years. The problem is they're developing new things to replace it already. I mean, it's endless. We've got ketamine, we've got hallucinogenic drugs, and we've got magnetic stimulation of the brain. So that the biological fixes will always be attractive, I think. A, because there's money, it's easy to make money out of them, especially in the American system based on insurance and so forth. And B, for the reasons we discussed before, it's simplistic, and we don't have to address the messier sides of our lives, things that sometimes we just don't want to talk about. So, but I am fortunate in as much as I get invited all around the world, increasingly online these days, obviously. And so I see the struggles going on in many, many different countries, all focused in this direction of getting a paradigm shift towards an evidence-based, social, relationship-based, humane alternatives to this pessimistic and unscientific approach that we currently have. And I'm optimistic that we will get there, but I'm not stupid enough to think it's going to happen quickly.
John, this has been friggin' awesome. I really do tip my hat to you, because you and many others are out there really moving the needle on something that is causing a lot of human suffering around the world. So well done, mate, and just keep up your great work, which I'm sure you absolutely will, because clearly you're a very passionate trailblazer in this place. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your years of really hard research and getting the message out there.
And thanks for having me, Paul, and thanks for the work you do in your field as well. It's a real parallel effort, I think, quite honestly.
Absolutely.